It's Ukrainian. It so happens.
And we're going to be talking about my book, 6 Cinder Blocks on Top of a Wall. And
Yeah.
you want to...
So we'll just kind of fire away here. So we did this book with Justin, and you can see it out front here. So why don't you go to the next slide, Justin, here. We'll kind of show you what the book looks like here. And all this is part of the minimalist wabi-sabi design aesthetic that we do, where we try to strip away the design. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the project here, and then we'll go into the book format and how we actually got it to where you see it now today. So this is essentially, Justin showed me these West Los Angeles alleyways, and then I thought, oh, what is this interesting? So I'm going to ask Justin some questions about this. Like, how do the alleyways relate to your project?
I started with the project. I had been... this was like the first kind of serious project I did where I was just using photography in a kind of traditional way. Before this, everything had been like, I did a whole project of appropriated images using Google like image search back when that was like a brand new thing. That's how old this project, or that's how long I've been working on this project. And old like family photographs and kind of more conceptual things. And so I was at like this sort of turning point, and I wasn't really sure what to do, and I decided just to like walk out my front door and start taking pictures, which was not entirely fruitful for a long time. But slowly, it was in alleyways that I was like finding something really interesting. And I think in hindsight, what was happening was I was trying to get to something that required a certain like slowness and like an observation and a quality of attention that was really hard to get. Basically taking pictures in someone's like front yard, like I was walking through like, suburban areas of Los Angeles or West LA. But in an alleyway, which is like a conceptually kind of a strange place because it's like a public place, but also you have privacy in a weird way. And there's not, you have like rite of passage, but you're kind of in someone's space. I could be alone, and I was working with this giant camera that is very conspicuous, and I could work really slowly. And so that, I think, I started directing my attention there. So in a way, I guess to answer your question, the alleys kind of offered an occasion for a quality of attention that helped me make the pictures I was trying to make.
Yeah, okay. Well, what do they symbolize for you, these alleyways? I mean, this is your neighborhood of West Los Angeles that you were going out and working in, but they're not about empty alleyways. You want to keep scrolling through them here, too.
Yeah, I should probably keep going, huh?
Yeah,
they're not about alleyways. So, I'm going up. Yeah, there's the like I was saying, it's like the quality of attention, and it was like a particular kind of picture I was trying to take, and I think I'll probably keep qualifying this like throughout like what I'm saying is this all kind of in hindsight because I made these pictures over about a decade. I think what I was trying to get at is like a frustration with the medium photography that it's like, and this is probably for a lot of people, it's fundamentally superficial because you are literally, working with a tool that looks at surfaces and records surfaces. And so there's this like tension to always try and figure out an angle to get around that. And that's what I think a lot of like the process is. So I'm out in the world making pictures, and like I think I was drawn to alleyways because they are the entire visual language there. I should keep moving. Sorry, it's hard to do this and talk. The entire visual language there is like thoughtless. It's all like based on indifference or neglect or conflicting agendas. Like overlapping property lines.
And it's this subliminal space that people don't think about. They don't think of it as a space that is people interact with, but in reality, it's the back end of everything we're doing all the time.
Right,
it's
yeah.
just as important as the front.
Yeah, and I thought of it as like a sort of like the physical subliminal space.
Yeah, exactly.
Like subconscious of like a neighborhood.
So why are there no people in the photographs?
Well, I think of them as being about people. So
Okay.
if there were, it goes back to like the type of attention that I want to highlight is that if there were people in it, it would kind of change the reading. Mm-hmm. So especially the picture, say like this, where it's, I want to draw someone's attention to this object being left there, the way it looks in that raking light, this, weather-beaten fence. And if there's a person there, that would just be the background.
Yeah. And then so it would be about the person and not about the spaces, which are their own entities, I guess.
And there's no people at all in these pictures. In some of my other work, people appear, but it's usually as kind of it's almost like for scale, I guess, or like as a prop. Almost, and always like unidentifiable and faceless.
So do you think this is a Zen project, like indicative of Zazen walking and meditatively walking, like you did for over 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Which, I mean, I don't know anything about Zazen, but
that's more my
that's your thing. Yeah, we've talked about it a little bit, but I don't want to. I'm not like a.
But you're definitely
a
meditatively walking through here and quietly observing all this.
Yeah, no, and that is something I realized, and that was like looking back at this. It required this prolonged attention and like whole, big blocks of time to make a few pictures. And it would often be like, and this is probably, isn't unique to this project. It's probably like anything, but it could be like hours of just sort of like staring and walking in order to like let my eyes adjust to what I was seeing.
So you can actually adjust your mindset to those spaces and the energy of those spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, when you think about that, how is the city perhaps then a character in this project? If there are no people, is the city itself, like the alleyways are, but like,
yeah, we've talked about that. I don't like when I was making the pictures. I had other titles for this work, and I never thought of it as having anything to do with LA. But anybody who looked at it, no matter where in the country I was, they were like, "Oh, I love LA," and I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't even like say where I was from, and they'd be like, "Oh man, Southern California, that light," and I'm like, "Well, shit." And so. I think, you just kind of can't get away from that. So there's a couple of ways that it specifically relates to the landscape here. And one of them is that the sprawl from this part of LA out to Santa Monica, that happened, between like the 30s and now, or I don't know when they finished building, the 40s. They built these big spaced out suburban neighborhoods because there was just a ton of land.
Yeah.
And when you build a big spaced out suburban neighborhood at that point, alleyways is what you did. And alleyways don't happen in a lot of places. They're like in Chicago and like some suburbs, but they basically got phased out of urban design a long time ago.
When did they get phased out of urban design officially? Because we're based out of Richmond, Virginia, says Zatara Press.
You've got great alleyways.
Alleyways.
Yeah.
And it has to do with, it was illegal to park on the streets at the time, so they built alleyways for people to park in the back. But I think, when did they stop that? 40s, the 50s?
Yeah, like 50s or 60s. And it wasn't, it wasn't like official, but I actually got, of course I went into like a deep dive about alleyways. And what's interesting is you can't actually find anything. Lewis Mumford, who is a really famous architectural historian, has like some great quotes about how nobody talks about alleyways and how he loves them. But there's like no writing about them. And there's this guy in Kentucky named Grady Clay, who he's kind of like a local activist, and he became like, his whole thing was just trying to repurpose alleyways there. And he made like a book about alleyways in Louisville. It's like an art book, but he made it just for like this civic purpose. And actually in some ways that kind of influenced the design of this. But in that book, he just talks about how going through all these records of, architectural or city planning from like all over the country, the word alley like stops coming up almost completely like at some point in the middle of the century. And he wrote the book in the 70s.
It's interesting how much things go in and out of design aesthetic phase or fashion, Well, thinking about that as you're scrolling through this, you've been walking through this for over 10 years, close to 14 years. Are there any stories you can talk about making one of these photographs? Anything brief, like a moment or something that you engaged with?
Not really, really.
That
but
means
the
there's not a lot of people in these alleyways.
It's like, no, I'm so focused on just like staring at. I went too far there.
You went too far. You got to go back.
I'm just like really zoned out and making these pictures, and I'm not. So it's this completely different way of engaging. Like the most I'd interact with people was like I got asked a lot if I was a location scout.
Yeah. Because it's LA, I guess. Yeah.
And that's like so you're like wandering around with a big camera, and it's like, what are you doing? What are you shooting for?
One of the things I love about this is your consistency of the light. Like he's extremely consistent in the quality and the color of the light and the feeling of it. So, is there a favorite photograph in the book then? If you've done this consistency, this universality of it, like what's your favorite photograph?
Thanks for asking. It's actually this one right here. So this picture I took probably towards the end of, I don't want to say like the end of the project, but it's probably like one of the later pictures that made it into the book, if not maybe like the last of like in terms of when I was shooting over this whole period of time. And it's where the title of the book comes from, obviously. Maybe not. I don't know.
This is the 6 cinder blocks.
There are 6 cinder blocks on that wall. And
you just mentioned it to me. We were editing, and he mentioned 6 cinder blocks. I was like, this is the title, and then showed me the image.
And what's crazy is that we had that whole we were going through everything and trying to design the book and talk about how we're going to do this, and then you were like, well, describe this to me, or you said like, what's the book the book in one phrase or something?
Yeah, exactly.
And I said it's 6 cinder blocks top of a wall, and you wrote that down. And you're like, all right, that's our title. We're done.
Yeah, it just made sense. You got to fit. Like finding a title itself is like an art form. But why is this an important image?
So this is for me. This is an important image because it kind of like I thought it was a success, like for me personally, because it's the most kind of restrained. But there's something for me very touching about the way this person stacked these blocks in this pattern on top of their wall that I feel like must have been considered. Like it's it's just
that's
for this
conscious decision.
Yeah, it's just for this purpose of like a little bit more privacy, I guess. Yeah. And they had these 6 blocks laying in their garden, and there was a decision where it's like in my mind that there was okay, the 2 pink ones go on this end, and this other pink one goes here, and there's something perfect about it. And there's qualities in this that I think has like a slowness where it's like you're not really sure it's like just a wall that I think ideally that asks the viewer to kind of look at it longer. And so also what's great about this picture is that after we settled on this being the title and we talked about it and I explained everything I just said to you to Andrew, I remembered that there was this drawing that I had read about, that went the wrong way, a couple of years before called 6 Persimmons. And it's painted by Mu Chi, a Chinese Zen Buddhist in like the 12th century. It's currently in a temple in Kyoto in Japan where it's brought out once a year. And I think you have to apply to see it. And if you're granted access, they ask that you look at it for 3 minutes.
3 minutes. You're supposed to sit and consider this.
And I just learned this, and I thought that was like so perfect because that's exactly like what I'm getting at. Like I with all the pictures, like I hope. I mean, I'm going too far again.
Going too far.
The hell's happening? Okay. It's just not even at my photographs, but just to stop and look at the world in any still frame for 3 minutes, I think is kind of a rewarding exercise.
I think it's a way of just trying to come into slowing your life down and taking that intention to consider what's happening, to slow our lives. So you can see here they are together. And that's a very famous, the 6 persimmons. Probably people in the audience know that. So,
but and they're also, I mean, vaguely arranged kind of in the same formation, and I don't know, I thought that was such a bizarre synchronicity to me. And it's also the book, the drawing is in Robert Adams' book Beauty and Photography, and that's where I found it a long time ago. And then when we're preparing for this, I mentioned using this image to Andrew, and he was like, and I was like, yeah, then maybe we can use that to talk more about Zatara. And he was like, that's crazy, because I was just showing that print to my new employee to explain Zatara.
We were literally showing it to him as an example of wabi-sabi to the new employee, Joe, and it was like less than 4, while we were planning this. So when we make a book, I guess the big question is, like, we make a book, like, how did we meet, in some function? I met him at Review Santa Fe and then met him again at the Medium Photo Festival. And so you were out there trying to get people to look at your work.
Yeah. Yeah, and it worked.
So you can't meet people in that function like that. and he was a stranger. And then we start the design process of the book, and you can see the final form here. And so we end up going through a number of covers, and so sometimes it's fun to show the variety of different forms of something I will show someone to try to get them to experiment. So we were looking for a little brick. At one point, we had this hand-drawn 6 cinder block in the back, which is indicative of other book designs we've done in the past, like Everglades or Nothing That Falls Away with Elliot Dudick and Meg Griffith, and Everglades with Lisa Elmline. Then we said single brick, and then we were struggling a little bit, but it's collaborative. We're always designing things, and I end up saying, Justin, why don't you play around and work on some bricks, and you can make 6 bricks and see. And he actually designed the rear of the book. It's all Justin, so credit where credit is due. And it kind of patterns down like the 6 persimmons, and it patterns down. And some people don't like the way we broke the words up, but it's a design aesthetic via the color of the foil stamping, and I think it makes it more interesting. You have to work to actually discover information. And this is what happens when you lay a book out flat, by the way. So later things get folded, into pieces and such things. So
and also, I mean, about this final design that we hit on was that it's a lot of people don't get it. And they're like, what is it called? 6 top blocks on.
My mother doesn't get it.
Yeah, and maybe it's like the way your brain is wired. But and so it kind of seems like a dumb way to design a book because you want to be able to read the title usually. But it's similar to what I was talking about with the 6 persimmons and having to look for 3 minutes, and also just, I don't know, the reward of staring at something for a little bit longer than you normally would.
Yeah.
I like the way that it requires someone who's casually walking by. They're like, wait, what? And you have to like look for a second, and then it kind of reveals itself.
Yeah, as a
much
designer,
like the photographs, hopefully.
Yeah. As a designer, we try to juxtapose something on the cover to be different than what necessarily is on the inside to divert what your expectation is supposed to be initially. And that's part of why we do this on all of our books. So this was kind of following in that Zatara Press design aesthetic too. And so when you go from that step, you meet this individual. They have to come to our building, and we work with them to elevate their images and to work on their files, and basically like a color working workshop kind of setup. But we also do sequencing here. And we have the sequencing with Justin here, fully bearded, looking great. And this is back in the Zatara Press studio here.
This was I went out to Richmond for a week for us to design the book and sequence it, and it was like the end of February 2020.
Yeah, it was like 2 weeks before the COVID.
Yeah, it was like there's like just a few news stories, and it's like, oh, that's weird. That's kind of I wonder what's going to happen. And I had a big beautiful beard pre-pandemic. Yeah. Lost it. Gone. Anyway.
Yeah.
So keep going here. And this is some interiors of the book. Do you want to talk about like why you were showing Joe that drawing and how that the sort of that aesthetic relates to like what you're saying about wabi-sabi and Zatara? As I scroll through these,
it's about the imperfection and the worn being beautiful. It's about the earth tones, about stripping away. A lot of design is over design, especially in today's era of design or European design too. And we try to bring it down to the core value and kind of let you bring information to the book, let you have to discover and to explore what's going on inside. And that's kind of what we tried to do as a design aesthetic and Zatara Press. And that's similar what the 6 persimmons. You're actually filling that information in by looking at it for 3 minutes.
That's not a rule, by the way.
It's not a rule.
You can look at it for less than that.
But we approach the editing and the sequencing. There's in a variety of ways to sequence a book. In this case, there was so much material after 10 plus 14, whatever years that he'd been working on this thing, that we sat and we said, okay, we think there's going to be a lot of images. So we started to create kind of a flow and a sequence. But in some ways, this is one of our heaviest books in the most amount of images that are in the book, because it is this typology of these alleyways, this record of it. So I wanted a lot. I didn't want it to be, you can have a book 28 images, you can have a book 32, you can have 54, 64, 88. And this is how many is this? 100?
Pages.
Not pages, image plates.
Images 66.
66.
96
so it's on
pages.
the high end. And we used thinner paper to accommodate that, to intentionally to keep the book feeling smaller and intimate, which was kind of an idea of the thought, because we want an intimate book shape and size. When you design a book, you also kind of determine the size first, and then you start to design the cover, and then you know the sequence of the images are going to be a certain size. In this case, we want them all to be the same size to give them a uniformity. Some books, you end up printing out 7 to 10 different little different size flashcards. They're not good quality prints, and you're using them to determine sizes and dimensions on blank dummies. And this one was easier because we wanted to kind of create the uniformity of all the vertical images. In that sense, not making it easy, but what were some of the challenges in working on the book? Justin's a great color printer and great color file work that he does, which isn't true of most of the people I work with. And so while we did have to rework files, which we did, it actually became more of an issue that he was so intimate with his work that a lot of the highlights would be barely capable of coming out in inkjet. Well, when you go to offset, you don't have as wide a color gamut. You don't have the ability to have as much of a dynamic range. So we had to scale things back and accommodate for things that worked in the initial print. Now we're doing the pre-press. We need to do that. And that's standard if you actually know what you're doing with books and making books. But because he kind of taken it right to the edge of what it could do, which is what makes it this beautiful ethereal color and lightness to the highlights. The sun, it looks like LA in that sense because he did it that way, which I loved. That's part of what we liked about it.
There's also the challenge of, and it's something I addressed more like before we got to the stage with the book, but I shot it half on Kodak Portra and half digital, and you really can't tell which is which, and that was like I didn't want it to be some weird split, and so that was a lot of work to make it.
And when you're
pretty clean,
when you're sequencing as well, like you're not sequencing thinking about that. Now you do actually, but like especially because you got to make a match because they don't really match, but you make a match. And in the end, I think we had about 8 or 9 portrait images out of the total 66 or whatever we had.
I don't remember.
Yeah, it wasn't as many because it was only as early first 2 or 4 years that you did that, and then the rest of the project you shot digitally. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but it wasn't as many, thankfully. And we've had some interesting projects in the past where we've had to edit 14 or 15 cameras and multiple film types together, which is interesting. And we'll talk about that another day. I love the repeating themes of the orange trees, repeating themes of the pink walls, the corners, the shadows and the light. And we repeat those kind of motifs in 5 to 7 kind of image segments, kind of, and sections that work together. How did you feel about the editing, the overall process? I mean, did you enjoy the process of what we were doing? Some people like to collaborate and edit, and some people are more standoffish. I felt like we were working. You really got into it.
Yeah, I really got into it. I mean, it was like it's so hard when you're looking at these same pictures for so long, and I gone through so many iterations that I had a really hard time editing it and sequencing it. So working with someone else was like pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And so I was really happy to get your input once we started really rolling on the book.
Like this was a file, like the Chikara we reworked a bunch of times. This is an example. Like it looks great, and it looked great before, but we reworked it so it would print properly on offset printing. Is just one example.
Well, it was. I mean, the actual print of this is just like really kind of over the top electric because that's what it looked like.
Yeah, and you can't do that on a machine.
And especially, it's on matte paper, and it looked.
It's
really
on matte
insane.
paper too. Well, then we also incorporated. Click forward to your text you had there. I saw that on there.
Yeah.
So we often incorporate text and imagery is a very important part of what we do in Zatara Press, and so I like to work with the artists. Now, some have short stories, essays. In this case, sometimes we have short stories from other people, like Emmanuel Uduma, or short stories from Anne McCrae Sullivan, the poet laureate at Everglades. In this case, we actually had the artist write a short story, Justin, and he worked on this I don't even know, memory piece. I don't know what you want to call it, and we edited it with our artists, doing copy editing and work and revising, and I'm really happy with it. I think it accompanies and doesn't explain what you're saying, but works in conjunction with it.
Yeah. It was so. I encourage all of you to grab a copy, like a viewing copy, and read it. It's very short, but it's. We talked about having like an essay, or
we thought about bringing in outside poets, which we've done before, but we didn't. That was serious talk
or have something more like addressing the topic literally. And so what I ended up doing is writing this short, sort of like creative nonfiction about. I grew up in West Virginia, and just about moving through like the woods and like the sort of like ungoverned spaces there, and as a sort of like as a similar space to alleyways, and it. I don't know. Like you should read it, and I think you'll get a sense of it. I don't want to say too much about it, but I intentionally left it a little bit not ambiguous, but I mean, the connection is obvious, but I didn't want to. I wanted to leave it kind of open ended, so the viewer going through the book, it gives them a sense of what it's going for, or at least a feeling, but doesn't explain anything.
But it's an art piece that works in conjunction with it. It's its own piece in some function too, and I think that's really important. That we don't just sit and explain things. Some books are just, oh, here you go, here's everything, and we're making art object books that are journeys, like an art house film or something, and you get to the end of it and you have no idea what Dennis Hopper was trying to tell you in his film. But like, as an example, but yeah, I'm still intrigued by these spaces, and during the early process, Justin was trying to get me to make the book, and I came out to visit him, and he was showing me the alleyways around his house somewhat, and we walked down. And at that point, we thought maybe I was just going to design it, and that's kind of what sold it on me was these beautiful prints and just seeing the alleys, And
that's something I wanted to ask you was that. So we met in Santa Fe in 2017 or something.
16.
And then later in San Diego.
That was 18.
And I showed you just some stuff on a hotel bed. And you mentioned that it sounds
that was
weird,
Brandon
right?
Thibodeau's
everything
hotel
happens
bed.
at
Brandon
a hotel.
Thibodeau's hotel bed.
Everything happens at a hotel, and then he didn't review my work, but we were like kind of hanging out that weekend. And
you do casual reviews like that in between people. It's actually very common. So if I review 30 people, I might review an additional 5. So I was looking at it casually. Yeah.
But anyway, but he mentioned later that that's when he kind of saw the work and was like, yeah, maybe we can do a book. And,
that's when it clicked.
It's when it clicked. So I was curious to ask, like, what had changed in your opinion, and also how you saw this relating to, like, like in that moment, like if you saw it like relating to other things you were doing, or like if it were kind of related to the mission of Zatara.
Sometimes you have to see things in different scale, and I don't remember the scale you showed me of the prints in Santa Fe, but I remember the prints that you showed in Medium in San Diego were 1620, right?
They were, yeah.
They're pretty big, and we had more than the 15 to 20 minutes to talk about it on the bed.
That's true.
And you get 15 minutes, and if you've ever been a portfolio review, you're doing, I don't even know how many people I'm doing in a day anymore, like 30 people, whatever, or 15 people in a day, and you're pretty cooked. And so to be able to kind of relax and to look at it more will sometimes be, you're trying to gauge the person too. When you want to make a book with someone, as I've discovered, there's a lot of beautiful images out in the world, and it's really easy to find a beautiful image and make a beautiful image these days, positive or negative. That's a different lecture. But the point is, it's a character analysis too. And like, walking through the alleyways of LA, I'm like, all right, Justin be a cool guy to make a book with. Like, and that's part of it. That's like a function of it, at least for us. Some people will print a book with anyone, but for us, it's about who do we want to work with for the next 3 to 5 years minimum, and who do we want to have a relationship with in that sense. And then who wants a book that's going to fit within not just our design aesthetic, but with our ethos and, the intimacy and the small edition, and wants a book that is a art piece itself. Some people have come to me with great books. They were great people, and it was like, hey, this is a museum book. You should go talk to UGA, University of Georgia. They'll publish it. And some of them have, the University of Texas. And it's like, we weren't the right fit. It needed essays and a preface and a curator and all this other stuff. And so I was like, this is a fit. This is a journey we're going to go on here. And, and I have a love of these type of spaces too. I've definitely photographed my share of alleyways, some of which are in another book I did after geography, but not in the same sense at all in any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, whenever we pick stuff in Zatara Press, we also try to have subjects we want to talk about, like environmentalism in the Everglades, or health and aging and pictures from the next day, or just having a good time at Mardi Gras and masks and obscurity of the individual's identity. And the Mardi Gras book, we did then and there. But in this case, it was about these remnants, like I said, these in-between spaces, subliminal spaces that these people put a lot of consideration into, and people don't, consider and spend time looking at. So that's, I think, what drew me to it. Yeah, in a nutshell. Could we have made it bigger? Maybe, I don't know. I like the intimate, small size of the book. You know, a Nazraeli book would have been this times 250%, maybe scale wise. The scale of the paper, same book, it's much larger. But how would you? Is there anything you would have changed, maybe, or done differently, maybe?
I don't want to go down that road. No, I'm really happy with it. I really like
Actually,
it.
I feel like this came out really well. I can't
Yeah,
say that
no,
about every book we've done.
the more, and also like time passes and I haven't looked at it in a while, and I picked it up to get ready for this. I mean, why would I look at my own book all the
No,
time?
I know what you
But I
mean.
picked
Yeah,
up
I don't look at them
to
all
get
the
ready
time.
for this, and I was like, God, I love this. I'm like, I'm just, yeah, no, I don't. There's nothing I'd change.
That
I
same
love
thing's
it.
happened to me with our books. You sit down and you look at something, you're like, oh no, this was a good one. Like, and they're all good ones, but they're like children. Some are troublesome, and some are not troublesome, and some are amazing, and some are genius kids. And so, that's a good analogy.
I feel
But
like we're now we're just patting ourselves on the back. So why don't we? Do you guys have any questions?
yeah, ask us any questions.
Ask me
Feel free.
questions. I tried. I tried during that time. During like so, I think I started taking the earliest picture in here is probably like 2009 ish. I started taking them in like 2007. I think
Yeah.
around 20 at different times, parts like different versions of this were printed places. A portion of it was printed in Ain't Bad, which is like a photo publishing. Like they used to do a quarterly, and they had like a Los Angeles issue, and I think they printed like 10 or 15 pictures. That
You
I
made
think
a lot of book dummies too. You showed
Oh
me
yeah, I
about
made a whole stack of book
stack
dummies.
of book dummies.
But it wasn't so much like when I decided; it's when it was ready. Like um, and I didn't. I mean, you mentioned that there was only like a handful of pictures on film, which I thought it was a lot
I
more.
think it's about 8.
But
Or
I think
maybe
that's
more than
because
that,
I
but
was
not
using
much.
film first, and I think the work. It's just that's like sort of a part of the thing with photography is there's this feedback loop where you look at it and it gets better. Like you can keep kind of going back to it, and because I was just doing the same thing, I mean, kind of like an idiot for like so long, it got way better, and I thought it was so good at the beginning, and I was so wrong.
But that's
So
how
it just
you spend time. You get
yeah,
to
yeah,
consider the
it
work.
took a
and-
long time for it for I think for it to be ready. Honestly. No, I'm good.
We had that
Um,
conversation while working on this book, and there was some point
I was still photographing it while
a
we were
little
designing.
bit, just
yeah.
at the very beginning, and like the first month or two into the design process, and I was like, you're good, man. You've got whatever 13 years of this. You're good. Like you've got it.
It is like a very comfortable like exercise creatively, and it's still I do it a little bit. Like I'll go to these places and photograph, but it's like not it's not part of like my real practice, I guess. And I'm definitely. I think after we finished the book, I didn't take pictures for a while
Yeah, you
because I was
didn't,
trying
no.
to stop
Yeah.
doing this, and I didn't know what to do. So it was just kind of like, yeah.
But that's something people
But
don't talk about, though. Coming down off of a project, I'm also obviously work as a documentary photographer too, and you come down off of a project, or in this case, coming off the alleyways, and what do you, how do you find the end, and how do you redefine your next project? And that's never talked about in school. They don't talk about that when they're teaching you, and it needs to be talked about more. You know?
I mean, I think you just kind of keep working on stuff.
Yeah,
I don't think there's a trick to it. You just
I
do
agree.
whatever. It doesn't matter. Like no, I mean it doesn't matter like if it's good or not. Like, it doesn't. You just have to keep moving, and then it like eventually it's something. Anybody else? Does that answer your question pretty well? Cool.
Yeah. Go ahead over there. Whoa.
Yeah, totally. Yes on both. The first question, yeah. Well, I mean, like when you're putting the effort into even just making a little book dummy by yourself, when you're putting the effort into that, it's like you get a lot more critical about what you're including, And so all of a sudden things that, were good enough to print and you thought were great while you're sitting there in, looking at it in Lightroom or whatever, or on Photoshop, are you like, that's maybe not, it's actually not, it's not an A picture. And also, or it's just not even part of this project. And so I don't know if it's like, maybe not like a revelatory, but there was definitely I took a lot of great pictures, and it's not, not just me like, patting myself on the back, but there's a lot of great pictures that were like, oh, this is not this at all. And they're just these orphans that kind of exist.
Yeah. You orphan photographs.
Yeah.
And you orphan them in the editing process too.
Totally.
Later in the book, great images that just don't fit with the flow or the sequence or the pairs or how they're going to lay on the page. And they're good images and they're not bad. They just don't fit for this project.
Yeah. So through that, wait to stop pretty soon.
Yeah, we got some
so
time.
through the making that stuff, it was definitely like you get a lot better at editing. And then the second question, there's another thing that I started doing, and it's a kind of I kind of come in and out of it because it's sort of complicated. But I've been making. I'll just say yes. Yes, there's another project. Well, it's like it's something like more abstract, dealing with like the specific marks that I would find on like the walls and surfaces in these spaces, and using alternative processes. And that came totally out of this. And I was sort of like shooting that while I was shooting this.
No people in that either, right?
No, I mean, it's not even recognizable objects.
Yeah, no. It's an experience. It's a journey to make a book with people, and that's the positiveness of it. And at the end, and then you get to this journey, and then you have the book, and then you run for a number of years trying to promote it and sell it. So that's kind of the idea. And I can't think of anyone better that we did it with than you, and it was a good time. And and that's the adventure. And at the end of the day, you're happy with what you have. Is there any more slides?
Yeah. I think we've repeated a lot of pictures at this point.
Yeah.
Because that's it.
That's no more questions? Or? Go ahead, yeah. I prefer to look at a portfolio or a sequence. So, and that's a good question because we want to design the book with you. And it doesn't interest me to have a fully formed book end up in front of me because first off, it's not going to generally meet the aesthetic of the company most likely. We do have a book coming out with Maya Meisner and Lorenzo Fantin, the designer, Lorenzo Fantin. It is very similar to Zatara Press's aesthetic, and so we've modified it, but it's basically that. But that's so rare. It was that one out of thousands of portfolios I've seen, or book dummies. And but yeah, it's better to have a portfolio. When Justin came, when you come to the editing process, I tell him to give me a list of his A list and a list of his B list, and so he had a portfolio, obviously, but you need to expand that for us to edit out of, because that was your best master prints,
right?
His best, exhibition prints.
Yeah, I think you only looked at like my top like 25.
25, yeah, that's all you can in a portfolio review.
So
but when you get to the editing process,
showstoppers or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. When you get to the editing process, I asked him, bring me 80 to 100 of your best, and then bring me like 20 or 30 what he thought was his Bs, and I'm using him or yourself as the first kind of tier of call, or else someone will show up with 500 images or something, and some of them, you have to kind of cull down. And you guys know somewhat. You know what your 100 or 150 are. You might not know what your 32 for the book are going to be, but you know that. And then we take it down, and then we work with you in conjunction. And you came with all these great little prints, and that's kind of how that works. So it's a similar thing. So when you give a portfolio to someone, it can be anywhere from 20 to maybe 50 images. And after that, that's probably too much until you get to the editing phase. And then more for the editing phase. I've had photographers show up who were like, I've got these 23 images. This is it. They're cyanotypes. This is all I've got. And I was like, I don't care how famous you are and what awards you have. It's a true story. That's not a full book. We need a lot more to edit down. I'm sorry. And so it happens more than you might think. So, yeah. But thanks. That's a good question. So that's it. Good questions?
I
think we're coming to the end time-wise. That's part of it.
Yeah, I think we're about done. Thank you. Thank all of you so much.
Thank you for coming out.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming out Saturday morning. And I mean it. We don't know any of you, so that's really great.
It's amazing.
Thank you so much. And hope you guys hang around and hear the rest of the talks.